Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going deep, deep, yeah,
Deep
a
dive.
deep dive into Tibetan Buddhist perspectives on life, death, and the nature of mind.
Big topics.
Yeah. And we're using Sogyal Rinpoche's The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. It's a pretty dense book.
Oh, yeah?
So think of this deep dive as like a cheat sheet,
Shortcut.
A shortcut, yeah, to some, really profound concepts without having to read the whole thing.
Yeah, Rinpoche's book really doesn't hold back. It dives right into those big questions, the ones we usually avoid.
Right, like death.
Exactly.
Rinpoche says death is the most crucial moment of our lives. Have you ever, actually thought about what kind of death you want?
It's funny, isn't it?
Okay.
We plan for everything else.
I know. Vacations, retirement.
Yeah. But we rarely think about, dying. Rinpoche says that thinking about death can actually make us appreciate life more.
So true. And Rinpoche knows a thing or two about death, right? He had to leave Tibet when the Chinese took over.
That's right. Lost his country, his family's wealth.
Wow. His family was one of the wealthiest in Tibet. They were known for supporting, all those Buddhist teachings.
And then, poof, it's all gone.
Yeah. Talk about impermanence.
Exactly. It makes you think about how something like that, losing everything would change someone's view of, impermanence.
Definitely. And that actually leads us to this idea of bardo, and it's not just about the afterlife.
Right. It's more than that. Rinpoche talks about bardo as this constant flow, like always changing.
Yeah.
Like we're always in transition.
We're in a bardo right now.
In a way, yeah.
It makes me think of the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Oh, yeah, all those states between death and rebirth.
But Rinpoche is saying these bardos are always happening, not just when we die. Do you think we're missing out by not realizing, we're in this constant state of change?
It makes you wonder, right? Rinpoche thinks we cling to this idea of permanence, that things stay the same.
Yeah.
And he thinks that makes us miss out on growth, on change.
Almost like we're sleepwalking through life.
Kind of, yeah.
Well, speaking of sleepwalking, Rinpoche tells this funny story about his friend, Dudjom Rinpoche. He was this amazing meditation master.
Oh, I've heard of them.
So they're in France, and Dudjom Rinpoche sees these beautiful cemeteries.
Yeah.
And his wife says something like, the houses for the dead are so nice and tidy here.
Okay.
And Dudjom Rinpoche, he's got this great sense of humor, he says. Yes, such a civilized country. Marvelous houses for dead corpses. But, he says, haven't you noticed? They have wonderful houses for the living corpses, too.
He had a point, didn't he?
It's pretty funny, but it makes you think.
It's like he's saying we get so stuck in routines, in chasing things we think will last forever, that we forget to really live.
Like we become those living corpses.
Exactly. Going through the motions, but not really present.
It's kind of scary when you think about it. And it makes this next story even more, interesting. It's a Tibetan story called The Father of As Famous as the Moon.
Okay. I don't think I know that one.
Okay, so picture this. There's this poor guy, and he finally gets a sack of grain, like his most prized possession.
Right.
And he hangs it from the ceiling so it's safe. And he lies down under it, right? But instead of just enjoying it,
He starts thinking.
oh yeah, his mind goes crazy. He starts thinking about selling the grain, getting rich, attracting women.
Oh, wow.
And then he imagines he'll have a son and name him after the moon. Because the moon's shining through the window, right?
So the whole time,
Yeah.
he's just lying there.
Under the grain. It's a perfect example of what Rinpoche calls active laziness.
I love that term.
We fill our heads with worries, with fantasies about the future instead of, dealing with what's right in front of us.
It's so true. From a psychology perspective, we see that as procrastination. Like we're avoiding the present moment by getting lost in anxieties about the future.
And it's almost like we're avoiding facing the reality that everything changes, right? That nothing lasts forever.
Yeah, that impermanence thing again.
Rinpoche talks about how this is a core teaching in Buddhism. Everything is always in flux, always changing. He quotes the Buddha describing it. Let me find it. Here it is. The Buddha says, "This existence of ours is as transient as autumn clouds. To watch the birth and death of beings is like looking at the movements of a dance. A lifetime is like a flash of lightning in the sky, rushing by like a torrent down a steep mountain."
Wow. That's beautiful.
Right. I don't know about you, but I feel that sometimes, life's just rushing by.
All the time.
And I think that ties into suffering. Rinpoche says clinging to this illusion of permanence, that things will stay the same, is a major source of our pain.
Especially when we think about death.
Yeah. Because if we're not willing to accept that things change, that things end, then death becomes this, well, this huge, scary thing.
It's true. Fighting change usually just makes us suffer more. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? Rinpoche tells a story about a woman who is dying, and through that experience, she found this incredible strength, this clarity.
It's like sometimes facing a crisis, even something as big as death, can change us for the better.
Like it forces us to see what really matters,
Yeah.
to let go of things we thought we needed.
Exactly, it's a wake-up call. And that leads to this other big idea in the book, The Nature of Mind.
Okay.
Rinpoche says our mind has two main parts. The ordinary mind, he calls it Sem, and then the true nature of mind, which is Rigpa.
Sem and Rigpa.
Yeah. So Sem is like that voice in our head, always chattering, comparing, judging.
The one that tells us we're not good enough, not happy enough.
Yeah, exactly. It's that part of us that always wants more, always feels like something's missing.
Oh, I know that voice.
I think we all do.
So is Sem like that ego thing we were talking about before, always trying to hold on to a sense of self?
That's it. But Rigpa is totally different.
How so?
Rigpa is that pure awareness that's beyond all the thinking, all the judging. It's like this source of real wisdom and peace.
So it's like quiet.
Exactly. And Rinpoche says it's always there, inside of us, but we're usually so caught up in the chatter of Sem that we don't notice it.
So how do we access Rigpa? Like, is there a switch we can just flip?
That's the big question. Rinpoche actually tells the story about how his own teacher introduced him to the nature of mind when he was just a kid.
Oh, wow.
And you know what the teacher did? He just asked him, what is mind?
What is mind? That's it.
That's it. It sounds so simple, right? But Rinpoche says it really shows how important it is to have a good teacher, someone who can guide you. It makes you wonder if we can even understand this Rigpa without some kind of direct experience.
It's a good question. Like, how do we even find an authentic path?
That's something to think about, for sure.
Hmm.
But speaking of paths, Rinpoche talks a lot about meditation. He says it's a way to quiet the mind, to let go of negative thoughts and maybe even get a glimpse of this Rigpa.
And meditation can be pretty simple too, right?
Yeah. Rinpoche gives these 3 basic instructions: bring your mind home, release, and relax.
I like that, especially that bring your mind home part. Like it's finding a place of peace inside of ourselves.
Exactly. And it's not just for monks or anything. It's something anyone can do, especially in our crazy busy world.
Like a little vacation for the mind.
Yeah, a chance to de-stress and maybe even connect with that inner peace that Rigpa represents.
Sounds good to me.
And from medication, Rinpoche goes into this whole thing about karma and rebirth.
Karma, like what goes around comes around.
Kind of, but it's not about punishment or reward. It's more about cause and effect, how our actions create consequences. But Rinpoche says it's not like we're trapped by our past.
So it's not like fate or destiny?
No, we still have choices. We can change how we act, how we think, and that shapes our future.
So we're not just victims of our past, we're creating our lives right now.
Exactly. And he tells this great story to illustrate it. It's about this beggar woman. Her name was Relying on Joy. And she didn't have much, but she had this huge heart full of devotion.
Okay.
And she makes this offering to the Buddha, just a little lamp. And she wishes for all beings to be free from darkness. Rinpoche is saying it's the intention that matters, not the size of the action. Even small acts of kindness can have a big impact.
And then he talks about rebirth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not like a fixed destiny. It's more like a continuation, like a stream of consciousness that keeps flowing.
And our actions shape that flow.
Right. And that leads to the 4 bardos, which we'll get into next time.
The 4 bardos. Okay. I'm ready.
It's a framework for understanding the journey of consciousness in this life and beyond.
Sounds intense.
It is, but it's also incredibly fascinating.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
Okay, so these 4 bardos are like a map, right? For consciousness.
A map for this life and beyond. We've got the bardo of this life, the bardo of dying.
Then after death.
Yeah, the bardo after death, and then the bardo of becoming, which leads to rebirth. I mean, it's wild to think of just our everyday life as a bardo.
Right. It's like what we were saying earlier, that idea that we're always changing even when things feel really stable.
Always in transition. And Rinpoche says understanding that impermanence is really important for navigating all those bardos, especially the bardo of dying.
He doesn't sugarcoat it either,
No, not at all. He describes everything, all the changes that happen as the body starts shutting down.
It can be pretty intense if you're not, well, prepared.
Yeah, it can be scary. But even in those final moments, Rinpoche says there are opportunities for spiritual growth, like even when the body's giving up.
Like the potential for insight just gets stronger.
Yeah, exactly. He talks about how at the moment of death, that true nature of mind, it just naturally appears. He calls it ground luminosity or clear light.
And if we recognize it, then what?
That's when we can attain liberation, freedom from suffering. So death is like a doorway to enlightenment.
It can be. But Rinpoche says we can't just, snap our fingers at the last minute and expect it to happen.
Can't just cram for it, right?
Nope. He says it takes practice throughout our lives, training our minds to recognize that ground luminosity, so when we see it at death, it's familiar.
So it's about preparing. Are there specific practices that can help us connect with that, with the ground luminosity?
Yeah, Rinpoche talks about Tonglen.
Tonglen, I've heard of that, but I don't really get it. It's like giving and receiving, right? But how can we take on the suffering of others? It seems kind of, well, paradoxical.
It's not about literally absorbing their pain, more about cultivating compassion, empathy.
Okay.
It's about opening yourself up to their suffering, really feeling it, and at the same time offering them your well-being, your peace.
So it's like practicing radical empathy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Rinpoche says it's really powerful, especially for people who are dying. It can help lessen their fear and their pain, and at the same time, it strengthens our own compassion.
So it helps both people.
Exactly.
And then there's Phawa.
Phawa, the transference of consciousness?
Yeah, that one's specifically about helping the dying person transition smoothly, to find a good rebirth.
And what's amazing, Rinpoche actually gives the instructions for Phawa in the book.
He does, so anyone can do it.
He says so, yeah. It involves visualizing your consciousness, like it's leaving the body through the top of your head and entering a pure realm, like the realm of Amitabha Buddha.
Sounds pretty intense.
It's powerful. It can bring a sense of peace to someone who's dying, and can even help people who are grieving feel a connection to their loved ones, even after they're gone.
It's pretty amazing that these ancient Tibetan practices, they can still be relevant to us today.
Right. Even if you're not a Buddhist, it gives you tools for dealing with some of the toughest parts of life.
Yeah, birth, death, suffering, and trying to find meaning. So, let's get back to the bardos. What happens after death? The first one is, what is it? Chikaya Bardo?
The Bardo of Dharmata. This is when the ground luminosity, the true nature of mind, really shines through.
Like, really brightly.
He describes it as incredibly clear, incredibly brilliant, like 1,000 suns exploding.
But most people, they don't even recognize it, right?
Well, Rinpoche says we're so used to holding on to our sense of self, our ego, that we miss it.
It's like we're standing in the middle of this amazing light show, and we don't even know how to appreciate it.
That's a good analogy.
So we need to learn how to recognize that light, even while we're still alive.
Yeah, that's where meditation comes in. It helps us get familiar with the nature of mind, that spaciousness. So when we see it in the Bardo of Dharmata, we can recognize it and relax into it.
And then we move on to the next Bardo.
Right, the Choni Bardo, the Bardo of becoming. This one can get, well, a little weird.
How so?
Well, you take on a mental body that's super light, super mobile, but it's also really influenced by your thoughts and emotions.
Rinpoche says it's 7 times more vivid than our normal consciousness.
And that can be good or bad. If you're still holding on to negative patterns, like anger or fear, you can have some really terrifying experiences in this Bardo.
Like scary visions.
Yeah, stuff like that, all fueled by your own anxieties.
But he also says that just one positive thought can lead to liberation.
That's the thing, the mind is so powerful in this Bardo. If you can cultivate even a little bit of compassion, a little bit of wisdom, it can change everything.
So even after death, we still have a choice.
We do. And those choices matter. Not just for us, but for all beings.
Okay, so in the Bardo of becoming, we're basically getting ready for rebirth.
Yeah, that's the idea.
But Rinpoche says most of us don't have a lot of control over where we end up.
Right, he says we're driven by our karma, by the actions and intentions from this life and all our past lives.
Like we're caught in a current.
Yeah. And he has this powerful image. He says we're drawn to our next rebirth, like a bird lured into a cage or dry grass catching fire. Like it's inevitable.
It sounds a little scary.
It highlights why it's so important to live virtuously, to cultivate compassion, wisdom, all that good stuff. Because our actions now, they have consequences that last beyond this life.
So it's not just about our own future, but about the world we'll be reborn into.
Exactly. It's a big responsibility.
So what happens when we're actually reborn? What's that like?
Well, it depends. If you're lucky enough to be reborn into a fortunate realm, like the human realm or a heavenly realm, you might experience a lot of joy and peace.
So like arriving at a beautiful palace.
Yeah, or being born to loving parents. But if you end up in one of the less fortunate realms.
The animal realm or the
Yeah.
hell realm?
Right? Those are full of suffering, confusion. You might feel intense fear, pain, trapped. It really depends on your karma.
It's a stark reminder that our choices have consequences. But even in those difficult rebirths, Rinpoche says there's always hope.
Always. He says the nature of mind is always pure, always luminous, even if it's hidden by negative karma. No matter where you are, there's always a chance to purify your mind, to wake up to that pure awareness.
It's like a light in the darkness.
Yeah, a reminder that we can always find liberation.
And that's what these bardos are all about, right? Not about being trapped in suffering, but recognizing our true nature and finding our way back to that pure awareness.
It's a journey, but it's a journey we can all take.
Rinpoche tells some incredible stories about Tibetan masters and how they died. Like his great aunt, Ani Palu, she was this amazing spiritual practitioner.
Really devoted, right?
Yeah, and also very practical, down to earth. But then a month before she died, everything changed. She let go of all her worldly stuff, and it was like she was in a constant state of meditation.
Really?
Yeah, she was singing these verses from the Dzogchen teachings, and it was like she was revealing her true nature, as she got closer to death.
Wow, that's powerful.
And she died so peacefully, like this light was radiating from her. It's such a beautiful example of how death can be this culmination of a life dedicated to spiritual practice.
Yeah. It reminds you that you have a choice in how you face death, that it doesn't have to be all fear and regret,
And Rinpoche gives advice on how to help people who are dying.
like creating a peaceful environment.
Exactly. Keeping things calm, minimizing distractions. He also says to be honest with the dying person. Tell them you love them, appreciate them, let go of any old arguments.
Yeah, forgiveness, all that.
And if they're open to it, you can introduce them to practices like Tomlin and Phawa.
Help them through the bardos.
Right. And he says it's not just about helping them, it's about helping ourselves too. To face death with more awareness, more courage.
Just like a practice for everyone involved.
Yeah. And he's really clear that we should keep helping even after the person has died.
Oh yeah, there are all sorts of practices in the Tibetan tradition for that, right?
To help the deceased find a good rebirth, to progress on the path.
Mm-hmm.
He describes this one practice called the practice of the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities.
Okay.
It's about visualizing the person surrounded by these deities, all this radiant light, purifying their karma, helping them move towards liberation.
Sounds beautiful.
It is, and it reminds you that we're all connected, even after death. And there's a story he tells about a Tibetan monk who was helping this man who had just died in a bus accident.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it was really sudden, really violent, and the monk could see that the man was, well, really disturbed.
I bet.
So the monk did a practice to calm the man's mind and then used Phawa to guide him to a peaceful rebirth.
Wow.
And there were these Westerners who saw the whole thing, and they were just stunned. They had never seen anything like it. It makes you wonder, what's really possible?
It really does. It's like a whole other level of understanding about life, death, consciousness.
It's like we get a peek into a reality that's always there, but we usually don't see it.
And that's what I love about these Tibetan teachings. It's not about some far-off afterlife. It's about understanding your own mind, the nature of reality.
It's a roadmap for navigating life with more wisdom, more compassion, more courage.
And ultimately, to live and die with a sense of peace and fulfillment.
Yeah.
To remember that we're all connected, part of something much bigger than ourselves.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to learn more about these practices.
It's a fascinating path.
Rinpoche also talks about near-death experiences, those glimpses people have of the afterlife after they almost die.
Right, those are fascinating.
He shares all these stories from people who've had them, pointing out the common themes, the insights.
What kind of themes?
Well, one that stuck with me was the life review. People describe seeing their whole lives flash before their eyes, all the good stuff and the bad stuff.
Watching a movie of your life.
Yeah, exactly. And Rinpoche says it's a powerful reminder that our actions have consequences, that we're responsible for how we live.
Makes you think, huh?
Yeah. It makes
Yeah.
you want to live a little more consciously, a little more kindly.
A lot of people who have near-death experiences, they come back and their whole outlook changes. They're more focused on love, on helping others.
Like they've been given a second chance and they don't want to waste it.
Exactly.
Rinpoche says there are a lot of similarities between near-death experiences and the Tibetan teachings on the bardos.
Oh, how so?
Well, for example, a lot of people who have near-death experiences describe feeling this overwhelming sense of peace and love.
Right.
And that sounds a lot like the ground luminosity in the Bardo of Dharmata. And then the life review is kind of like the karmic bardo of becoming, where we face all the results of our actions, and get ready for our next rebirth.
It makes you wonder if there's some kind of universal truth, something that connects all these different traditions, even across cultures, across time periods.
That's a pretty mind-blowing idea.
It is, and it leads us to this deeper exploration of the nature of mind and, what are they called?
The three kayas.
Yes, the three kayas. They're basically three aspects of the enlightened mind. Or you could say three dimensions of reality.
Okay, this sounds complicated.
It is, a little. But basically, there's the Nirmanakaya, the dimension of form. This is the world we experience with our senses, physical objects, appearances.
Their everyday reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then you have the Sambhogakaya. This is pure energy, pure bliss. It's where the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas hang out, those who have realized their true nature.
Sounds pretty nice.
It is. Pure joy, pure enlightenment. And then the big one, the Dharmakaya.
Okay.
The Dharmakaya is ultimate reality, the ground of all being.
This is that ground luminosity we keep talking about.
Yes. It's beyond all concepts, all duality. It's the source of everything.
So how do these three kayas relate to the bardos?
Well, Rinpoche says how we experience the bardos depends on which kaya we're most in tune with.
Okay.
And most of us, because we haven't trained our minds, we're stuck on the level of the Nirmanakaya. So when we die, that's where we go. Even though the Dharmakaya, that ground luminosity, is right there.
We're missing it.
We are, like moths drawn to the wrong flame.
But if we meditate, if we do those spiritual practices,
Then we can start to wake up to those other kayas, even while we're still alive.
and that can change how we experience death.
Completely. We can recognize the ground luminosity. We can navigate the bardo of becoming with so much more peace, more awareness.
It's like we're retraining our minds, seeing a much bigger picture of reality.
That's the essence of the spiritual path. Recognizing your true nature, becoming who you're meant to be.
Wow, that's powerful. What else does Rinpoche talk about in the book?
Oh, so much. Like emotions. He actually describes how in the bardo of Dharmata, pure energy starts to manifest as emotions.
So our feelings are rooted in that pure awareness.
In a way, yeah. But he says when we cling to those emotions, when we make them part of our identity, then they get distorted. They cause suffering.
We take something pure and twist it into something negative.
Right. But if we can see emotions for what they are, impermanent, empty, then we can experience them without being overwhelmed by them.
So it's about learning to ride the waves.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And that's a skill that can transform your whole life, not just in the bardos.
And that's where meditation comes in, right?
Exactly. It helps you cultivate that space between you and your emotions.
You can observe them without judgment, without letting them control you.
Finding that peace, that stillness within, even when things are chaotic.
That sounds like a pretty amazing place to be. Are there any other insights you want to share?
Oh, there are so many. Rinpoche's book is full of them, and each one gives you a different perspective on the mind, on dying, on the potential for freedom.
It sounds like a real journey of discovery.
It is. It takes courage, curiosity, and a willingness to let go of what you think you know.
But it sounds like it could lead to something truly incredible.
It could. You know, one thing that stuck with me from the book is how Rinpoche talks about finding a real spiritual path.
Yeah, he calls it the spiritual supermarket.
Right. Like, we're just browsing,
Trying a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
but never really committing.
It's like that shopping mentality we were talking
It's
about.
always looking for the quick fix, the easy answer.
But Rinpoche says real spiritual growth, it takes
It's
dedication
discipline. Yeah.
and a willingness to really dive deep into a specific path.
It makes sense. I mean, if you want to get good at anything, you have to put in the work.
Totally. And he says it's so important to find a good teacher, someone who can, guide you.
Someone who walks the walk.
Exactly. He tells the story about Kundro.
Khandro.
She was a student of this great master, Jamyang Khyentse.
Okay.
And after her master died, she kept living in the same place, where he had lived and died.
Wow.
She devoted her whole life to prayer and study.
That's dedication.
And Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, he said that whenever he visited that place, it felt like Jamyang Khyentse was still there.
Really?
Yeah, like he was alive in Khandro's devotion.
That's amazing. It shows you the power of that connection between student and teacher.
And how it can last, even beyond death.
It makes you think about what it would take to have that kind of devotion.
Right, like what are we really looking for? Are we willing to do what it takes to find it?
Big questions.
Rinpoche also gives some advice on how to connect with a spiritual master, even if you can't, meet them in person.
Like visualizing them?
Yeah, he says you can picture them in your heart, feel their presence, and ask for guidance.
I like that.
And he says the most important thing is to have real devotion and trust.
Makes sense.
He writes, "Whoever thinks of me, I am in front of them." It's like saying that connection goes beyond time and space.
It's always there.
And that can be such a source of strength, on the spiritual path.
Definitely. It can help you through anything.
Through the tough stuff in life, through the mystery of death.
And help you realize your potential.
I think one reason I like this book so much is how Rinpoche uses all these stories and anecdotes, to explain these really deep teachings.
It makes it so much easier to understand.
Right. You can see how it all applies to your own life.
Definitely. Like that story about Ben and Kong Po.
And the Sogyal Rinpoche statue.
Oh, yeah, the talking statue.
So Ben, he was this, tough Tibetan guy, and he goes on this pilgrimage to Lhasa.
To see the Sogyal Rinpoche statue.
Yeah, the one they say was brought to Tibet by that Chinese princess Wenqing.
Back in the 7th century.
Right. So Ben gets to the temple, and he's totally overwhelmed by, the sacredness of the place.
I can imagine.
He's so moved that he takes off his boots, these big, heavy boots, and leaves them at the foot of the statue as an offering. But then he has to go into town, and he doesn't want to carry his boots.
So he asks the statue to watch them.
Yeah. Not really thinking anything of it.
And then?
The statue talks. It says, "Stop. Put those boots back. I'm watching them for Ben of Kongpo."
No way.
Yeah. And the guy who takes care of the temple, he freaks out when he sees these boots on the altar.
I bet he did.
But the statue tells him to leave them alone.
Wow.
And when Ben comes back for his boots, the statue tells him to come back next year and that it'll visit him. Ben thinks the statue's joking, but a year later, his wife sees this thing in the river glowing like the sun.
Okay, now I'm hooked.
And when they pull it out, it's the Sogyal Rinpoche statue.
It came to visit Ben.
It kept its promise.
That's an incredible story. It's like a reminder that, anything is possible.
Yeah, that the sacred can show up anywhere.
And that everyone, even a regular guy like Ben, can have a connection to the divine.
It's a beautiful message.
It is. And I think that's one reason why this book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, it just keeps speaking to people.
It's so timeless.
It offers comfort, guidance, inspiration. Anyone who wants to understand life and death and, the mind, they can find something in this book.
It reminds us that death isn't the end. It's a transition.
And that we can create our own destiny.
Through our actions, our thoughts, our intentions.
It's a call to live with more awareness, more kindness.
To really appreciate each moment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's think about this. If life is all about change, are we really paying attention?
Are we embracing that impermanence, or are we clinging to things that won't last?
What can we learn from these Tibetan teachings to live and die with more peace, more wisdom, more compassion?
These are the questions we want to leave you with.
Questions to guide you on your own journey of exploration and discovery.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying.
May you find peace and happiness.